Hello everybody and welcome back to the John Schofield Trust podcast, a space for early career, aspiring and working journalists to get advice and insights into the industry. I'm your host, Bethany Lee, an early career journalist and 2024 fellow of the Trust. This episode, we're diving into the world of podcasting with our guest, Georgia Coan. Hi, Georgia.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited for this episode because I love podcasts. I obviously produce and host this one, but I also co-host another one with my friends on the side. So I'm really excited to learn more about working in podcasts full time. So yeah, we're going to dive into that. First, introduce yourself, your career. How did you get into the world of audio and journalism in general?
Yeah, so my name's Georgia Coan and I am a podcast producer. I've been in the industry now for, I worked this out the other day, 8 years, which is quite scary when I'm thinking about it. I don't feel that old, but so I started out as an apprentice. So I got onto the BBC Journalism Apprenticeship, and that was the third cohort I think they ever did. And this was the local where there was about 7 of us all based in different local radio stations, and it was a 22-month scheme. So I did that, got my gold standard NCTJ and all of my experience at Three Counties Radio, which was the local station to me at the time. And from there, I built my career within the BBC. So I then started working for Radio 4, set up a podcast called Beyond Today, which was very popular at the time, was a daily podcast where we would look at different topics and do almost documentary style episodes really every day. So very high production, as you can imagine. And then I joined the BBC News podcast team, which is now part of Long Form Audio, where we made newscasts. We also had a podcast called The Next Episode, which was younger audiences. And yeah, essentially was kind of the start of the BBC News podcasting empire that they now have. And later on, just before I left the BBC, I joined the wider department where I was making programmes for Radio 4, World Service, and working on investigations as well. I did an investigation for File on 4. And now I'm at the Telegraph. I did do a short stint as a freelancer where I was working for Bloomberg and working on lots of different projects. I did a development project for Audible as well, and then I became a staff member at the Telegraph, so I now make both narrative and daily news podcasts there.
So your official job title now is podcast producer?
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
I'd love to break that down a little bit more, as in what does that actually entail? What does it, like, typical day in the life of a podcast producer look like?
It's a great question. Every day is different. I would say, depending on if I'm working on a narrative series, it's very different to if I'm working on the daily podcast. So with the daily, it's very, I would say the pace is quite quick. We get up, we have our morning meeting. So obviously in the morning, we're across what's happening in terms of who's doing the rounds media-wise. We're all watching and listening to various radio programmes and TV news channels to try and get an idea as to what other outlets are talking about and what stories they're focusing in on. And so we'll go into the office, we have our morning meeting around 10 o'clock, and that's where we'll discuss what is the thesis of the day, what are we going to be speaking about. And the concept is, I guess, that we want to try and appeal to the Telegraph audience, so talk about topics that they're interested in and they want to know about. So we'll often look at the website to see what's trending and what articles are most popular in terms of people commenting underneath them. But we'll also be considering, we have people that listen to our podcast that are not usual Telegraph readers. So it's about trying to take a story and make sense of it. And we have our 2 presenters, Camilla and Tim, who are such great personalities and they just work so well together. And so much of the morning is preparing for whatever topic that we've decided that we're going to look at. It's about doing the research, writing the briefs, putting together a structure for the programme. And often that will be, rather than too much scripting, it will be bullet points and points that we want the presenters to make and then we record the podcast from about midday to 2 p.m. We'll often be doing pre-records as well around those times, and then we start putting it together straight away, and we use an editing software called Descript, which is a lifesaver. And honestly, I don't know how people don't use Descript now, because I'm not getting paid commission or anything, but it's so helpful in terms of being able to see a transcript in front of you and know exactly what you're going to edit out, because it essentially you're editing the transcript, but at the same time it's taking those cuts away in the audio as well, so that when you export it to put it into Audition, which we use to then build the episode, you've already made the cuts in the episode and taken stuff out editorially that you wanted to get rid of. So it's so helpful. It also means that we can send that to the lawyers as well if it's something that is legally sensitive, and they can see exactly what is being said, and they can say to us, right, cut this bit, cut that bit. So it makes our life so much easier, makes the editing process a lot faster, and then we'll, as I say, export it and put it up on Acast, and that's the episode done. Exactly. So it is very fast in terms of the turnaround, but with narrative it takes a bit more time. I worked on one earlier this year that took me 3 months to put together, but they each come with their own challenges and also their own joys as well. So I enjoy doing the both.
They're both very different in sort of approach and also like the journalistic skills that are needed almost for them. I know in your introduction you mentioned the File on 4 episode that you did on Andrew Tate.
Yes.
Such an amazing podcast episode, by the way. Really culturally relevant topic, of course, but also the mix of sort of the different accounts I think works really well. So I wanted to ask a little bit about sort of how that came about, and how do you go about tackling such a big and controversial topic like that in podcast form specifically?
Well, thank you. I do appreciate that, because sometimes you make these programs, you put them out, and you don't really know who's listening to them or whether they've had that much of an impact. That story, so Andrew Tate, I've always been interested in these types of characters, because unfortunately they do come from my area. Don't have the best reputation in terms of I love Luton, by the way. I grew up in that area, and there's some amazing parts of it and amazing people as well, but there are unfortunately people who have a negative have created this negative association. So when I was looking at Andrew Tate and I was seeing a lot of the stuff that he was posting online, I actually knew about him quite a few years previously. So this was when he really had only just started posting, and I saw a lot of the stuff that he was doing. At the time I remember seeing it online and thinking, gosh, this is quite intense and what's happening. I didn't really get a lot of attention, I guess because he was still relatively unknown at that point. And then he seemed to just reappear out of nowhere, didn't he? And everyone was talking about him, and unfortunately a lot of young men were then following what he was saying with Hustlers University and wanting to get involved in what he was doing. And so I pitched it to various different places at the BBC, and funnily enough, a lot of people at the time, because they didn't really know who he was, I think there was a reluctance to really do anything with that, because people just thought, oh well, I don't know who he is. A lot of young audiences already knew. And then there was that initial arrest in Romania that really got a lot of people talking, and it wasn't just young people who knew who he was anymore. So it was a moment where I really pushed for us to do something about it in long form audio, and the editor at File on 4, he was really keen to do something as well. And I think my connection to the area meant that I was able to talk about him in a way that meant, well, this is the issue, is that actually sometimes we put these people in a light that means that they're not human anymore. It's almost as though they take on like a godlike status. And I think it was really important to look back on where he started and how he became who he is today. And he grew up on a council estate in Luton, the exact same council estate my mum grew up on. So that's the main reason why I wanted to do something about it. And I'd done a Radio 4 documentary a few years previously about Tommy Robinson and extremism in Luton. So I'd always been attracted to those types of stories. And yeah, I just felt that actually it was one that was very important at the time, especially around his arrest. And that's when we got together, and the producer Hayley and Paul Kenyon as well, who was the co-presenter, and just told the story of how this man became who he is today, and also the people who had been impacted by him, because we did speak to a woman in the programme as well who told us her experience, and her testimony was so powerful and strong. With the podcast, I think it reached lots of people and did really well numbers wise, but it also got a lot of pickup on other parts of the BBC as well, and we ended up doing lots of two-ways on different radio programmes, and it also got a slot on the TV programmes as well, on the news channel. So it shows you that when you really push for a story like that, and you say, actually, I'm not taking no for an answer. And I think that determination meant that it did get really good outreach, and eventually people realised how important it was and gave it the time and the space that it needed.
I think there are just certain stories that work really well for like the podcast format.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Is there anything that you look for in a story, like any elements or things that you look for that make podcasting the best format for it?
Yeah, I would give the example of the story that I worked on earlier this year. So I produced a 3-part investigative podcast with one of our journalists in the newsroom about a tech boss called Jan Marcelik, who became the ringleader of this Russian spy group. So it was a really complicated story, and one where there were lots of different threads to it. And that type of story, it can be really intimidating because there are so many different elements to it. But I think for me, when I'm looking for a story that I know is going to work for a podcast, it's about, first of all, the material. So how many people can you get on record? Because clearly if no one will speak to you for a podcast, it doesn't really work for audio. So how many different voices can you get? When you're doing a story for the newspaper or for online, a written piece, sometimes these people will only give you 1 or 2 comments and you might take a few quotes from them. While as with a podcast, it has to sustain, as you know, a much longer period of time. So it's about what material can we get from this? Who can we speak to? The archive as well. What material is already out there, what's available. So when I'm doing a documentary style episode, I did another one earlier on this year that was about Grenfell. So it was a really important topic. And when I'm doing these types of stories, it's about how do we... I think the joy of podcasting and audio, it allows you to tell a story with a longer period of time. So it's not like, as I say, when you're writing a story or you're doing a package for TV where you might only have 2 minutes. Or online, you might only be able to take a few quotes. With podcasting, the joy of it is that you can tell a story over a longer period of time. So, as I say, with the Grenfell episode, we used lots of archive, so news reports. We also did some really powerful interviews with survivors, and that meant that we could really tell the story over a longer episode. And it is really about the building blocks with any type of narrative podcasting. Is you need to be able to take that material and essentially build a story that makes sense to the audience. You really have to sit down and think about how you're going to get from A to B and really work out what the story is before you even start, because there are so many different complicated elements to it. And for me, that's what I'm looking for is, first of all, is this an interesting story? Can we explain it in a way that the audience are really intrigued and interested by? Because, you know, unless it is a story that people are really invested in, you're not going to listen to never mind a 20-minute podcast, you're not going to listen to an hour-long documentary podcast. So that's what I'm looking for is there enough material for audio?
Yeah. The fact that it's a podcast and can be done in like these 3-part series and things like that means that you can dive deeper, but then it's also like sustaining the interest
exactly
long enough for 3 parts is like a challenge in itself.
Yeah, and it really is challenging. I mean, having to storyboard such complicated stories, and sometimes you don't even think it makes sense, so you're trying to write it and script it in a way that makes sense to the audience. And also with audio, it's all about the descriptions. It's all about painting stories in a way that people can see the pictures in front of them. Because with TV, it's so much easier. I mean, people are seeing it right in front of them. But audio, you have to hold people's hands a bit with that.
Hi. This is a quick pause from the episode just to say that the John Schofield Trust is a charity. And if you want to support the work that we do and help the next generation of journalists break through, then you can head to www.johnscofieldtrust.org.uk/donate. Thank you, and let's get back to the episode. If there's any early career journalists who are listening who are wanting to go into podcasting, but maybe they're at sort of the beginning of their careers, what do you think are the core skills that they should be developing from early on?
Very good question. I feel that the core skills that you need when it comes to podcasting, so it depends what type of podcast you want to go into, because there are so many different genres now. Entertainment is going to be very different from news. News is going to be very different from narrative. There are all these different elements to podcasting. I think people find their own niche and often enjoy different elements to it. I think with news and journalism, what I would say is that it's really important to be creative, because I do feel that working in audio, you do have to be a lot more creative. You have to think about what's really going to get people invested in the podcast and listening over a longer period of time. And I would say another core skill, particularly when it comes to journalism, I would say people skills. It's so important to have people skills. Building up relationships with people, building a contacts book, that's a really important skill to have. Don't ever feel that you can just leave a story alone. It's like once you've put that out the door, that's it then. I always keep in contact with people, because you never know when that story might come up again, and really build those relationships so that hopefully, you know, if that story then, you know, you get to a point where there is an update on that story, those people are more likely to come back to you and speak to you. So yeah, I think the people skills are so important. Creativity. I also think with podcast producing, audio editing is its own skill, and there are different elements to it that I feel if you want to go into podcasting, you can start doing now, and you can start teaching yourself. When you start training yourself on using these different platforms, it can be really helpful. So whether that's downloading Audition, or, you know, different types of I used to use something called Hindenburg as well, which is very similar to Audition, but it doesn't really matter what you're using, because my experience is that different production companies and different media outlets will use different editing software. So you need to be flexible and be able to jump on whatever editing software is needed of you to use. So I do believe that just having those core skills when it comes to audio editing, mixing is obviously different from just, you know, basic editing. There are literally, it's a separate role a lot of the time. Sound mixers do an incredible job. I mean, a lot of our narrative programs that we produce at the Telegraph are then sound mixed. So someone will literally put the music together, put the sound effects in, you know, sort out the audio, make it sound beautiful. But that's also something that, especially when you're short staffed, you may be asked to do as well. So it's really good to have all of those skills. And if I was in the early stages of my career, again, I would be thinking about downloading software, teaching myself how to edit, looking up YouTube videos, TikTok videos as well. There's some amazing TikTokers now who will literally show you the basics of how to edit on different programs. So yeah, getting those core skills, and also understanding where to find stories as well. I think pitching stories, you don't realise the power of pitching a good story. I know people who have reached out to editors and said, oh, I've got this great story, and the editors have loved it so much, they said, okay, right, you can come and work on this program for 2-3 weeks, make this happen. And so I feel it's so important to have those core journalism skills that will allow you to be able to pitch and to really stand out from other people. I think that's important.
Do you have any specific tips for pitching a podcast idea, whether it's somebody who doesn't work for a media organisation already or somebody who does and is looking to pitch something within their own organisation?
Yeah, it's slightly different maybe from internal to external, but I would say that if you're trying to pitch from inside, what I've found to be the easiest approach is often sending an email and writing a pitch document. So that may be, I mean, some people are really creative with this and they might do a PowerPoint. That's how a lot of the external companies do it. So the indies will often create these pitch decks where they've gone into, you know, they'll create like a 10-slide pitch with the contributors, the basic storyline, the locations, all these different aspects of the podcast. But if you're early on in your career, then obviously you're not necessarily going to have the resources or the experience at that point to create a pitch deck. But it may be that you do a pitch document that includes who you want to speak to on the podcast, what the story is, what the new elements of it are, because it might be a story that has been done before, but you have a new element, whether that's a new voice or a new point of view. There's different ways to approach the same story. I mean, we saw that with the Andrew Tate story. Lots of people were doing it, but there were each program or each podcast was slightly different. So I do think that there's a way to stand out, and the best way is often to do, as I say, a pitch document. You can do that in an email as well, but it's really important to have an idea as to how the podcast is going to sound, what your role is as well. I always say that to people, like, really advocate for yourself, especially early on in your career. If you want to present a podcast, say that, because often people won't know what you want unless you say it. I think sometimes we worry about seeming overconfident or a little bit too arrogant by saying, I would like to present this. But often if it's your story and you have the contacts or you have a personal relationship to the story, like the Andrew Tate one, then there's no reason why you can't pitch yourself to present it. And sometimes it doesn't work out and they say, actually, we're going to use someone that we already know, but you then will be the producer on it, or you'll be working with someone and be able to learn from that producer. So I think the best way, personally, I found, is to send that email, get the email for the person that you want to pitch to, send them the information in a really, I'm not saying send 5 pages worth of pitch information. I don't think that's a good idea, but I think keep it as brief as possible, but also really make yourself stand out. Yeah. Whether that is with images or a mood board, something that really shows what you want to achieve with the story and what you're looking to try and tell the audience. I personally find that's the best way, but also asking to grab a coffee as well, because often, even if you don't get a pitch commissioned, an idea commissioned, there is a way that you can still take that relationship with that editor and make that work for future reference, whether that's pitching other ideas or saying, could I come and shadow for a few weeks to find out what types of stories your team are looking for, or the best ways to pitch a story. So I think networking is so important now in this industry, particularly in podcasting.
Of course, absolutely. And I want to come to the title of this episode, which is should more journalists have podcasts? What's your initial sort of just response to that? It's a very broad question, but
yeah, I do feel that podcasting, it's so important in terms of for journalists, the journalists I've met who maybe initially didn't start out from those backgrounds, were not in audio, but then have later joined and started working more in podcasting. They're always so amazed by the fact that they don't have to cut as much from their stories. And I think when you've worked on an investigation for, say, like 2-3 years, and you're asked to cut so much of it out when you're doing a long read. Even with long reads now, you know, a lot gets cut out.
Yeah.
While as in audio, a lot of that stuff you can keep in. Journalists now have started to realise that the stories that they're doing can travel much further if they're doing it through podcasting. They're able to keep a lot more information in there. Also, we've started to see a rise in kind of, you know, these sit-down podcasts with journalists as well. I know with the podcast that I produce, The Daily Tea, working with Tim and Camilla, our journalists in the newsroom, it's so interesting how you're able to really understand how they work as journalists and get a behind the scenes as to how they come about stories and how they have different ways of looking at a story. And I think that actually for journalists now, podcasting is a way of, I guess, lifting the curtain and allowing people to see behind decisions, and it creates transparency in many ways. And I think that journalists now have started to realise, okay, this is a way for me to, first of all, get my stories to travel faster and further and faster, and also get more impact and more audiences. And yeah, so I feel that we're only now starting to see this, people realise just how important it is to have your stories on lots of different platforms, but particularly in audio.
I think that there are more and more journalists who are making these podcasts, or even just more news organisations making more podcasts. So it's definitely being recognised as a medium that you can kind of do a lot with that you maybe can't do in other mediums and things like that. To anyone listening who's thinking like, I'm really not interested in making a podcast, that's fine too. But I also think listening to them is so valuable, even just for like seeing how news organisations are doing things differently and adapting to different platforms and how they tell stories in that way. I listen to so many, and I think it's definitely like a valuable tool.
Exactly. And this is it. You realise now a lot of newsrooms are investing more in podcasting because they see the value of it, and they're starting to understand that, you know, we work very closely with journalists in the newsroom who now come to us. Before we were pretty much begging people to come and, you know, work with us. And now they'll come to us and say, oh, listen. So with the Grenfell episode, Rob Mendick, the reporter, came to us and said, oh, I really want to do a podcast on this. And so it was just so important to be able to work with him from the get-go and understand like what he wanted to do with the story, what he was doing in terms of his articles, so that we could make sure that the podcast reflected that, because they all roll out at the same time, and so they need to be able to sit together on the website and really appeal to the audiences in different ways. And so just, I think podcasting allows, especially in a newsroom environment, a lot of journalists, as I say, but editors are now saying to themselves, okay, we want to invest more in this because we understand that it's a way of telling a story that a lot of our audiences, first of all, it really appeals to underserved audiences, younger people as well. A lot of younger people listen to podcasts now, and it's a way of telling a story, as I say, and not having to condense it too much, and being able to really also see change as well. A lot of podcasts have led to change. I mean, the Times did a podcast about Kenneth Law, who I don't know if you know much about, but it's this guy in Canada who had been accused of sending out poison through parcels, and the Times did this podcast, which then was made into a documentary as well. And that shows you just the power of a story like that as a podcast then being made into another medium and really leading to change, because that then led to a point where people knew about the story and an investigation. You know, the crime agency now are looking at this individual and into different kind of cases relating to that. And so it shows you that journalism, the power of it can be extended through audio and allow you to tell a story in a much more you can go so in depth with a podcast. I feel that you can't go with other mediums.
We're running out of time, which is making me sad because I could talk about podcasting and the podcast industry for ages. But I did want to ask, because you did a masterclass with the John Schofield Trust a few years ago now. And in that, not to put you on the spot, you said that you wanted to see less celebrity podcasts. Do you stand by that?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, there probably wasn't even as many.
Yeah,
as
there
is
probably
now.
like only a few, and now there are
Insane.
so many.
It's actually insane how many
Yeah.
there are. I do feel that there is a place for those types of podcasts. I am still a big believer in podcasting. Started out as a place where, and I think this is why it's so popular, because often with these types of podcasts, you want a friendly voice. You want to feel like you're in the room with these people having these conversations. You want to feel really included. And I think that's the joys of podcasting, is that there is an intimacy that you don't necessarily get with listening to the radio. And so that's how it started out. And it started out as being a bit more niche. And so you had these people who, they've built careers off the back of what started off as quite small podcasts, and now they've got this cult following. And so that for me is so important. I don't think we should lose what podcasting started out as. And I do feel that sometimes we get a bit lost in people who have a large following, and we're like, okay, we have to have this person presenting this podcast because they've got 1 million followers on TikTok or Instagram or whatever. And actually we do still need to give a voice to people and allow people to start their careers in this industry, and not forget that that is what podcasting was built on, is, you know, almost introducing people to new voices and new talent. I think creating and building and showcasing new talent is what podcasting should still be about. And so, you know, maybe looking back, it's probably a little bit harsh, because they're popular and there is a place for them. But I just think we should remember that, it's important to give a voice to people who are relatively new in the industry, and allow them to show their talents as well.
Yeah, I think then there needs to be space for both.
Exactly. And it's really important.
Yeah, it's more and more podcasts are coming out, and the problem is that if it gets too oversaturated, then there might not be space for both. So it's more like, I guess, making an active effort to make sure there is.
Exactly. And I think we've got other things to worry about right now. You know, introduction of AI podcasts, and as you say, really good point on oversaturating the industry and the market, and that's a worry for a lot of people in podcasting right now. The whole point of podcasting is that you have a connection to real people, and people who actually have lived experiences and are sharing their experiences. And I think a lot of people don't want to listen to someone who's not real.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the next issue that I think people are more concerned about. So actually, I take the celebrity podcasts over those any day, personally.
We're going to need a part 2, because there's so much to talk about.
Topic,
Absolutely. But no, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Thank you for tuning in to the John Schofield Trust podcast. For more episodes, make sure to follow us. Or if you want to know more about the Trust, head to www.johnscofieldtrust.org.uk and follow us on Instagram at John Schofield Trust. See you next time.